The lamps along Kensington Row gave a feeble glow that October evening, throwing long shadows against the elegant but slightly faded facades of the houses. At No. 17, the home of Mrs. Beatrice Harwood, widow of the late financier Gerald Harwood, a dreadful mystery had just begun to take root. The air was sharp with autumn chill, and the faint rustle of dry leaves along the pavement was the only sound until the shrill cry of a maid broke the silence and summoned the neighbors into uneasy whispers. Inside the Harwood residence, the scene was confounding enough to unsettle even the most hardened constable. Beatrice Harwood lay motionless in the drawing-room, slumped against the blue damask settee, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Death had claimed her, though whether by violence or some mysterious malady was far from apparent. There were no wounds upon her body, no trace of poison upon her lips, no overturned furniture to suggest a struggle. She had been found as though in the midst of a quiet evening's reading. Her spectacles perched at the end of her nose, a volume of sermons open upon her lap. Yet something was distinctly wrong. For one thing, the fire had been allowed to burn down to cold ashes, though the room was draughty and chill. For another, a single sheet of notepaper rested on the escritoire by the window, bearing a scrawled message in a trembling hand. "The key is in the ashes." Inspector Gerald Latimer, a precise and somewhat humourless man from Scotland Yard, was the first official to arrive. His lantern jaw tightened as he surveyed the scene. The maid, white as linen, insisted she had found her mistress precisely so at 8:30, when she brought in the evening tray. She had screamed and fled for help, drawing the attention of neighbours, who now hovered on the pavement outside. Beatrice Harwood had dined alone that evening, the cook confirmed. No visitors had entered, the butler swore indeed. The door had been locked from within since dusk. It was that detail, the locked door, that most troubled Inspector Latimer. Both front and back entrances had been secured, the windows bolted from the inside. Yet the message on the desk suggested some deliberate act, some final communication. Latimer bent to sift carefully through the dead ashes in the hearth, the maid watching with horror from the threshold. No key was there. Nothing but grey powder and brittle fragments of charred wood. He shook the cinders through his fingers and frowned. Whoever had written that note had either been deceived, or wished to deceive. The widow's reputation lent further strangeness to the case. Beatrice Harwood had been regarded in Kensington society as a woman of refined tastes, if not of warm company. Since her husband's sudden death 3 years earlier, an affair whispered to involve ruinous financial speculations, she had withdrawn into her household, keeping company with few besides her servants and her lawyer, Mr. Jameson Blythe. Yet even the servants admitted their mistress had not seemed entirely at peace. At times, they had caught her pacing late at night, speaking under her breath as if to some unseen presence. And once, only a fortnight past, the cook had overheard her mutter, "They think it's over, but the key will bring it all to light." Now here she lay, with that enigmatic note and the locked room conditions that made her death appear as impenetrable as the grave itself. Latimer ordered the body removed under medical care, though the doctor could offer little at first glance. Heart failure, perhaps, but the curious note made natural death difficult to accept. There was also the matter of the locked escritoire drawers. The key to those was not among the lady's personal effects. Only one small drawer stood open, containing the widow's spectacles case and a single lavender sachet. The neighbors, meanwhile, gave conflicting accounts of what they had seen. Mrs. Fenwick from No. 15 swore she had heard a carriage drawing up at 7:30, though the butler insisted no one had entered. A newsboy claimed a man in a dark overcoat had loitered opposite the house around 8 o'clock before vanishing down the row. Still others muttered of ghostly lights at the windows earlier that week. But nothing could be pinned down, and the inspector grew increasingly irritable as he tried to fit these shadowy details together. The strangest discovery came an hour later. When Constable Perry, searching the smaller sitting room adjoining the hall, uncovered an odd object behind the curtains. A single black glove of expensive make, damp as though recently worn in rain. Neither the butler nor the maid could identify it as belonging to any member of the household. It carried no initials, no mark of ownership. Why it had been left there, discarded hastily or placed deliberately, was another knot to the growing tangle. By midnight, the house was sealed. The body conveyed away, and Inspector Latimer was no closer to a coherent explanation. If Mrs. Harwood had died naturally, why the cryptic message about a key? If she had been murdered, how had the killer entered and escaped a locked house? And what did the glove signify, if not the presence of a stranger? Latimer sat heavily in the drawing-room, staring at the cold hearth. He brushed the ashes one last time, and as he did, his fingers encountered something hard. He drew it forth, a fragment of metal, twisted and half melted, scarcely recognizable. Yet it bore the faint outline of a key's bow. It seemed the message had not lied entirely. But why had the key been consigned to the flames, and what lock had it once commanded? The inspector's frustration deepened. He disliked puzzles that smacked of theatrics. This had all the marks of some elaborate contrivance designed to confound the law. Still, the facts were facts: the locked room, the widow dead, the note, the glove, and now this charred relic. He resolved to return at first light with reinforcements and a locksmith to examine every drawer, cabinet, and strong box in the house. Somewhere in the widow's secretive existence lay the truth, though buried as deep as the ashes of that key. For now, Kensington Row slept uneasily, its residents whispering of foul play and restless spirits. And within the silent house of Beatrice Harwood, the questions multiplied in the dark, unanswered and insolent, daring anyone clever enough to unravel them. It was an unsolvable crime, or so it seemed. But the dawn would bring sharper eyes than Inspector Latimer's, and the riddle of the Widow of Kensington Row had only just begun. Morning crept grey and reluctant across Kensington Row, softening the sharp edges of the night before, but doing nothing to ease the unease that hung about No. 17. The blinds were still drawn, the great house shut up as if it resented the intrusion of officialdom. Inspector Latimer, already at the door with his constables, muttered irritably about wasted hours. He had little patience for mysteries that insisted on cloaking themselves in theatrics. Yet as he prepared to resume his plodding inquiries, he found himself confronted by an unexpected presence. A tall, angular gentleman with a keen, watchful expression and a manner at once polite and faintly amused. Lord Peter Wimsey, self-styled amateur of crime and inconvenient puzzle solver, had heard whisper of the night's occurrence through the oddly efficient network of gossip that so often found its way to his ears. And now, here he stood at the threshold, adjusting his monocle as if appraising not merely the house, but the very atmosphere that clung about it. "Morning, Inspector," he said lightly, as though they had met by arrangement at a gentleman's club rather than at the scene of a baffling death. "I hear we have a widow who refuses to die quietly. Thought I might have a peep." Latimer's mouth compressed. He disliked amateurs meddling in his affairs, but he also knew Wimsey's reputation for untangling the very knots that had left the yard confounded. With a grunt, he allowed the gentleman entrance, though not without a warning glare that bespoke his unwillingness to tolerate interference. Whimsy, unperturbed, merely tapped his cane upon the tiles and stepped inside with the air of a man entering a stage set prepared for his scrutiny. The drawing-room lay as it had, save for the absence of the body. The curtains hung limp, the ashes cold, the note still upon the escritoire. Whimsy bent at once to the desk, holding the slip of paper up to the light. "Interesting hand," he murmured. "See how the letters tremble more at the beginning than at the end. Not the usual course of a weakening pulse. Suggests deliberation rather than collapse." He replaced the note delicately, and his sharp eyes moved to the hearth. Latimer showed him the twisted fragment of metal drawn from the ashes. Whimsy examined it between forefinger and thumb, nodding. "Burnt intentionally, I fancy. But why half melted?" A long poker placed it directly into the hottest heart of the fire. Someone wanted that key gone thoroughly and quickly. Our widow, perhaps. Or a visitor with less lawful motives. The constables moved through their methodical search, but Whimsy wandered with the light tread of a cat, pausing at small things others dismissed. He glanced at the settee where the body had been found, stooped to pick a thread from the carpet. A long blonde hair, finer than the widow's iron grey locks. He examined the books on the shelves, pausing at a gap where a volume had clearly been removed and replaced hastily. The dust lines were uneven. "Not sermons these," he remarked softly, running his hand along the spines. "Financial histories. Our Lady kept curious company in her reading." In the hall he paused again, at the stand where the coats hung. "This one," he said, fingering a heavy cloak, "is damp at the hem. Yet the servants swore no one entered last night. Unless Mrs. Harwood took it out herself, which seems unlikely for a woman who rarely stepped beyond her doors. It belongs to someone else." "But who?" His eyes flickered to Latimer, who scowled, unwilling to admit such oversight. The butler, summoned again for questioning, appeared stiff. His voice smooth but his eyes restless. Whimsy addressed him with disarming courtesy. "Forgive me, my good man. But was your mistress in the habit of writing notes in so shaky a hand? Or is this rather unlike her usual correspondence?" The butler hesitated a fraction too long before replying that it was, indeed, her handwriting. Whimsy inclined his head, but his glance lingered on the servant's pale knuckles as he gripped the back of a chair. A man trying very hard not to betray something, Whimsy thought. Then came the curious matter of the glove. Latimer had set it aside, but Whimsy requested to see it. He held it delicately, sniffed faintly, and raised an eyebrow. "Scented," he said, "not with lavender, as one might expect, but with tobacco. A Turkish blend, rather strong. Belongs, I should say, to a man. Expensive leather, foreign stitching. Someone of means, or someone wishing to appear so. A curious article to leave behind so carelessly." He dropped it back upon the table, but not before noting a small smear of grey ash at the wrist, as though the wearer had handled the burnt key before discarding the glove. The maid, poor girl, was summoned again to repeat her story. She quavered through her account of finding her mistress lifeless, her hands twisting in her apron. Whimsy leaned forward, his voice kindly. "And when you entered, my dear, did you notice anything amiss? A sound, a smell, a light where it should not be?" She bit her lip, hesitating. Only that the window curtain was moving, sir, though the window was shut. As if someone had been there before me." The inspector dismissed it as fancy, but Whimsy's eyes glinted. Curtains stirred not without cause. Draught from an open sash hastily closed, perhaps. Or the brush of a departing hand. By noon the house had yielded no further secrets to the constables. Yet Whimsy's mind was alive with possibilities. He wandered once more into the drawing-room, where his gaze fell upon the escritoire again. He tried the drawers, all locked. Odd, Inspector, he mused, that our widow should keep her desk locked, yet leave the key to it in the fire. Unless, of course, that key did not belong to this desk at all, but to something far more incriminating. Latimer grunted. We'll have a locksmith in to open them. Routine procedure. Indeed, Wimsey said softly, adjusting his monocle. But if you'll permit me, I suspect the more interesting secrets are not in the desk at all, but in the small inconsistencies that others overlook. He glanced meaningfully at the damp cloak, the blonde hair, the trembling note. There is deception here, Inspector. The lady may be dead, but someone very much alive wished to shape the manner of her death. A masquerade has been performed in this house, and not altogether convincingly. Latimer, impatient, snapped orders to his men. Yet even he could not wholly dismiss the nagging sense that Wimsey's words rang true. For all the neatness of the locked doors and bolted windows, there were cracks showing in the facade. A hand too steady in its supposed trembling, a glove too carelessly placed, a curtain that had moved when no draught explained it. Someone had erred, and those errors would be the threads that, once tugged, unraveled the entire tapestry. As Wimsey stepped out into the pale afternoon light, his face was thoughtful, his eyes bright. The puzzle was only beginning to take form. But already he smelled the faint aroma of deception, as unmistakable as the tobacco that lingered in that glove. The Widow of Kensington Row had left behind more than a corpse and a cryptic note. She had left a stage upon which others had played their parts. And Lord Peter Wimsey, with his keen eye for the misplaced and the illogical, was determined to discover who among them had overplayed their hand. The afternoon settled heavy over Kensington Row, as if the houses themselves leaned in to listen to the whispers that had begun to stir in the neighbourhood. Lord Peter Wimsey returned to No. 17 with Inspector Latimer at his side, both men aware that the real work must now begin. The questioning of those whose lives had intersected with the late Beatrice Harwood. Death left ripples, and in those ripples one might glimpse the shapes of hidden truths. The servants were gathered in the morning room, pale and anxious, their eyes darting nervously between the detective and the inspector. The butler, Mr. Fenton, stood stiff as a poker, answering in clipped tones. The maid, Alice, wrung her hands, while the cook, Mrs. Perce, folded her arms defensively across her apron. Wimsey, adopting his most genial manner, began with questions so simple they almost seemed idle. "Tell me, Fenton," he said, "what sort of visitor did your mistress usually receive? Neighbors? Family?" Fenton hesitated. She was not sociable, sir. Rarely anyone called, only Mr. Blythe, her solicitor, once or twice. A woman I did not know came in a motor car. Always in the afternoon. Otherwise, no one. "Ah," said Wimsey, polishing his monocle. "And this lady, did she leave her name?" Fenton's lips thinned. "No, sir. I was not told." Wimsey glanced at Latimer, noting the stiffness of the reply. The butler was too guarded, as though weighing each word before letting it pass. The maid's nervous shifting beside him, however, betrayed a different story. When pressed gently, Alice admitted she had seen the visitor once. "A fine lady, sir, with yellow hair. Tall. Wore gloves, always gloves. I thought she was a friend, but Madam seemed uneasy after she left." Wimsey's brows lifted slightly. The blonde hair he had found on the carpet returned to his thoughts, fitting too neatly into this recollection. But he let the point rest, merely nodding. Mrs. Pierce, the cook, proved more blunt. "Mistress was troubled of late, that's certain. Pacing at nights, muttering. I heard her say once, 'They'll not trap me. I'll see to that.' And another time, she mentioned a key. "I thought it was just fancy talk." "Qui, Whimsy murmured. "That is becoming quite the refrain." He made a mental note, filing the detail beside the charred relic in the hearth. When the servants were dismissed, Inspector Latimer muttered, "Superstitious chatter." Nothing more. But Whimsy shook his head gently. "On the contrary, Inspector. Superstition has a way of draping itself around inconvenient truths. The cook's honesty is more useful to us than the butler's polished reserve. Did you note how he stiffened at the mention of visitors?" Their next call was upon Jameson Blythe, the solicitor. He received them in his office, an orderly room smelling of dust and parchment. Mr. Blythe was a precise man with pince-nez and a clipped manner that mirrored Latimer's own. He claimed to have seen Mrs. Harwood a week prior, in good health though, little agitated over certain financial papers. She wished to alter her will. Blythe admitted reluctantly, nothing dramatic, merely a revision of small bequests. The bulk, of course, remained untouched. She was not a wealthy woman by comparison to her husband's heyday, though she lived comfortably. "Revisions to a will," Whimsy said softly. "So close to her death. That is a most obliging coincidence. And who stood to benefit from these alterations, if I may ask?" Blythe adjusted his spectacles. "Merely an increase in provision for a distant cousin in Yorkshire, a woman named Lydia Crane. Hardly suspicious." The widow was of independent mind. Yet Whimsy noted how swiftly Blythe provided the name, almost too swiftly, as if rehearsed. And though the solicitor spoke smoothly, his fingers tapped restlessly against the arm of his chair. A small contradiction lingered too. He described the widow as in good health, while the cook had spoken of her as restless, troubled. Which portrait was nearer the truth? When they departed, Whimsy remarked quietly, "Did you hear, Inspector, how quickly he produced that cousin's name? As though he expected us to ask. And yet, why should he assume we knew of the will at all, unless he feared discovery?" Latimer grumbled but made a note. That evening, in the fading light, Whimsy sought out the neighbors who had peered from their windows on the night of the death. Mrs. Fenwick repeated her claim of hearing a carriage draw up. Mr. Talbot, across the street, swore he saw no carriage at all, but insisted on the figure of a man standing in the shadows near 8 o'clock. A newsboy, bold now in daylight, said he had seen a lady with yellow hair stepping quickly into the Row not long before the scream rang out. Contradictions wove themselves into the tapestry, each thread pulling against the other. A carriage or none, a man or a woman, one detail, however, remained steady: the blonde-haired stranger. She emerged in every account, vague yet persistent, like a figure half hidden behind a curtain. Back at the Harwood house, Whimsy took the liberty of speaking with Alice once more. Alone, the maid seemed less fearful, though still anxious. "I didn't tell the inspector before," she whispered, "but that lady with the yellow hair, she gave me a coin once, when I opened the door. A sovereign. Sir, told me not to speak of her visits. Said mistress would be cross if I did." Whimsy's eyes brightened. "And you kept this coin?" Alice nodded timidly, producing it from a pocket. It was genuine enough, though more money than a servant might easily ignore. Whimsy thanked her with gentle words and left her reassured. Yet his mind worked quickly. A lady who bribed servants to keep her presence secret was no casual caller. When he reported this to Latimer, the inspector dismissed it as likely some foolish acquaintance embarrassed to be seen. But Whimsy was not so easily swayed. "Foolish acquaintances," he said, "rarely burn keys and leave tobacco-scented gloves behind them. No, Inspector. We have a player upon this stage who wishes very much to appear invisible, and is succeeding only in leaving footprints too faint for all but the sharp-eyed to notice. As the evening deepened, and the row grew quiet once more, Wimsey stood at the window of the drawing-room, gazing at the curtain that had so disturbed the maid. He touched the fabric, noticed the faintest trace of soot along its hem, as if a gloved hand had brushed against it after tending the fire, a hand wearing that very glove now locked in evidence. The widow's death, the trembling note, the charred key, the blonde-haired visitor, the servant's half-truths, and the solicitor's rehearsed answers. All of it formed a chorus of voices, each singing a different tune. Yet beneath the discord, Wimsey began to hear the faint rhythm of deception, steady and deliberate. Somewhere among these voices was the truth, carefully muffled but not entirely silent. He smiled faintly to himself. Lies, after all, had a curious way of unmasking those who spoke them. One only needed to listen long enough to hear where the harmony broke. And Wimsey, with his keen ear and sharper eye, was already beginning to mark the false notes that would, in time, reveal the hand behind the widow's final performance. Night drew down again over Kensington Row, the lamps glowing dimly through a mist that softened the sharp outlines of the houses. Within No. 17, Lord Peter Wimsey sat by the dead hearth where the charred key had been found, his long fingers steepled and his expression intent. The house was quieter now. The servants dismissed for the evening, yet it seemed to hum with unspoken secrets. Every voice he had heard that day still rang in his mind. Alice's frightened honesty, Fenton's measured evasions, Blythe's polished explanations, and the neighbors' contradictory sightings. Each had spoken some portion of truth, but each, too, had concealed more than they revealed. What troubled Wimsey most was not the lack of motive, but the abundance of them. Too many reasons hung in the air, yet none fit neatly with the manner of Beatrice Harwood's death. Inspector Latimer, heavy-eyed and irritable after a long day, muttered that it was all jumble of half-baked tales, but Wimsey only smiled faintly. "Aye, Inspector, the motives are there, tangled like string in a cat's cradle. We must tease out which thread leads us to the hand that tied the knot." The butler Fenton, for instance, had lived long in the widow's service, yet his stiff answers betrayed more loyalty to secrecy than to truth. Why? Wimsey remembered the restless glance, the whitening knuckles. Could it be fear? Servants sometimes concealed their mistress's eccentricities out of misplaced duty, or perhaps their own sins were involved. Had Fenton known of a visitor and lied to cover it? Had he himself admitted someone by stealth? There was fear in his manner, but fear of what, or whom? Then there was Alice. Poor girl, she had spoken with guileless tremor of the bribe slipped into her hand. That sovereign was telling. Bribery bespoke urgency, a desire to remain unseen. Yet Alice's very nervousness suggested she was less a conspirator than a pawn. Someone had used her silence to cover their comings and goings. She might have been too frightened to speak, but in her fear she had revealed more than she knew. The cook, Mrs. Perce, seemed the least tangled in deception. Yet her words hinted at another layer of motive altogether. She had overheard the widow muttering of traps and keys, of being pursued. Was this paranoia the residue of her late husband's financial scandals? The widow had withdrawn from society after his disgrace, but financial ruin often left behind angry creditors, ruined partners, or bitter rivals. Fear of exposure could be a powerful motive, for Beatrice, or for those around her. Mr. Blythe the solicitor presented yet another piece of the puzzle. His quick mention of Lydia Crane, the distant cousin, had seemed rehearsed, as though he anticipated suspicion. Why the eagerness? True, revisions to a will were not unusual, but they carried the scent of greed like a perfume. Did Lydia Crane press for more, or did Blythe himself see opportunity? A solicitor, after all, often stood in the position to manipulate his client's affairs. And why describe the widow as calm when others found her restless? One of them lied. And then, the mysterious visitor with the yellow hair. She loomed in the shadows of every account. Alice's memory, the newsboy's glimpse, Mrs. Percy's mention, the neighbor's story. She was the most persistent ghost in the tale, yet no one admitted her openly save Alice, and Alice only in whispers. Who was she? A creditor's widow, a wronged mistress. Perhaps Lydia Crane herself, come from Yorkshire without announcement. Whoever she was, her bribe, her secrecy, and the strand of hair upon the carpet all shouted of her presence at the very heart of the matter. Jealousy, greed, desperation. Any of these might fit her motives, but until her name was known, she was little more than a silhouette behind a veil. Whimsy turned these threads over in his mind, piecing them together. None explained the whole. Greed might account for the will. Fear might account for the widow's mutterings. Revenge might explain the burned key, if it unlocked some shameful relic of her late husband's dealings. Jealousy could belong to the unknown woman. But how did they align with the locked doors, the cryptic note, the glove, the discarded cloak? Each clue seemed to point to a different hand, a different motive. It was as though the crime were a tapestry woven by more than one weaver, each strand distinct yet bound into the same dark design. Inspector Latimer, yawning, rose to depart, but Whimsy lingered, restless. He drifted once more to the escritoire, tracing his fingers along its locked drawers. Somewhere here, perhaps, lay the missing center. "What did you fear?" "Mrs. Harwood," he murmured. "And who feared what you might reveal?" The locksmith came the following morning, working deftly at the locks under Latimer's supervision. When at last the drawers were opened, their contents proved curious but not conclusive. Letters neatly tied in ribbon, most mundane, save one packet of correspondence signed only with initials, which Blythe later claimed were financial associates of Gerald Harwood's. Account books, some years old, showing losses greater than society had suspected. And at the very back, beneath the false bottom of one drawer, a folded sheet that caught Whimsy's attention at once. It was a bank receipt, dated only weeks earlier, showing a large withdrawal in cash. Where had that money gone? "Another piece for your puzzle," Latimer muttered sorely. "Money missing, strangers about, a suspicious will. One motive or another ought to do." "Ah, but which?" said Whimsy lightly. "That is the difficulty, Inspector. Each road seems to lead us into another, until the whole thing is a maze." That day they sought out Lydia Crane herself. She had come to London upon word of the widow's death, a tall woman with pale hair. Though not quite the shade of the strand Whimsy had found, Lydia seemed earnest, even indignant, when asked about her cousin's affairs. "I had no expectation of her will," she declared firmly. "Indeed, I had not seen her in years, save for a brief visit last spring. She sent me money once, out of kindness, but we were hardly intimate. I did not even know she intended to alter anything." Her indignation had the ring of truth, though her presence in London so quickly was itself noteworthy. She had alibis for the evening of the death, too. She had been dining with friends in Mayfair, several witnesses to prove it. Yet Whimsy's eye caught the nervous way her hand strayed to her reticule when mention was made of the missing cash. Was it guilt, or merely the nerves of a woman unused to interrogation? By evening, the tangle had grown thicker. The servant's evasions, Blythe's polish, Lydia's protests, and the unseen blonde visitor all pressed upon the case like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. Whimsy, pacing in the widow's silent drawing room, felt the weight of them. One motive was greed, another fear, another revenge. All present, all plausible. But one fact was clear: no single story explained why Beatrice Harwood had died locked in her own house, with a note by her side and a key in the ashes. He stopped at the curtain once more, brushing the faint soot that clung there. That glove, that bribe, that burned key, those were not the work of random accident, nor of natural death. Someone had crafted this with deliberate hands, hands driven by a motive strong enough to risk deception. Somewhere in the maze, a line of truth ran straight, waiting to be traced. Wimsey smiled to himself, his eyes brightening in the dim light. The maze was intricate, yes, but every maze had an exit. And he, more than most, enjoyed finding the way out. The following morning brought a stir of activity at Scotland Yard. Inspector Latimer, shoulders square with the satisfaction of a man who felt the ground firm beneath him again, announced that a decisive turn had come in the Harwood affair. The gloved hand of the mysterious intruder, so it seemed, had at last revealed itself. For the glove itself, tested and examined, bore a faint trace of ink upon the lining, and within that smear the Yard's laboratory men claimed to discern letters, the initials J.B. Latimer wasted no time. He summoned Mr. Jameson Blythe to the Yard, confronted him with the glove, and produced witnesses who swore they had seen a man answering to his description, walking briskly from Kensington Row that night. The solicitor protested vehemently, but his polished tones rang hollow against the mounting suspicion. The connection appeared damning the initials, the convenient knowledge of the will, the eagerness to explain the cousin's name. All, Latimer declared triumphantly, pointed to Blythe's hand in the affair. Wimsey sat quietly through the proceedings, his long fingers drumming softly against his knee. He watched Blythe's protests with narrowed eyes. The man did not look terrified so much as outraged, the offense of a gentleman accused of vulgar crime. And yet there was a rigidity about him too, as though some weight pressed heavily upon his conscience. When Latimer declared, "We have our man," Wimsey gave a faint, courteous bow of his head, but his eyes glinted with something very far from conviction. At No. 17, the news spread quickly among the servants. Fenton, the butler, wore an expression of grim resignation, though Wimsey noted how he avoided the inspector's gaze. Alice, on the other hand, whispered eagerly that justice had been swift, while Mrs. Perce clucked disbelievingly that lawyers were all sly foxes anyhow. Even Lydia Crane, called again to hear the developments, expressed relief that the matter was soon to be concluded, though her fingers continued to fidget at the edge of her gloves. Yet, for all the official triumph, Wimsey could not shake the dissonance. Something in the neatness of it all struck him as contrived. The initials upon the glove, how conveniently legible, how obliging to the Yard. The neighbors' contradictory testimonies, how easily now they were bent to fit Blythe's supposed flight. And most troubling of all, the absence of any clear motive that truly explained the widow's cryptic note or the burned key. If Blythe sought only to profit from a will, why risk such a theatrical killing? Why the elaborate staging of ashes and trembling handwriting? That evening, while Latimer prepared his report with the self-satisfaction of a man who foresaw promotion, Wimsey returned alone to the Harwood residence. The house stood silent, shuttered against the night, but the key had been left with the constable on duty. Inside, the air was cold, the fire long since dead, and the drawing-room still held the ghostly hush of secrets unsaid. He moved slowly about the room, pausing at the escritoire once more. The altered will, the bank receipt, the packet of letters, all lay where Latimer's men had filed them away. Whimsy studied them afresh, considering each. The will favored Lydia Crane, yes, but not excessively. The bank receipt spoke of money withdrawn, but there was no proof it reached Blyth's hands. And those letters, unsigned, initialed only, hinted at financial ruin but offered no smoking gun. Nothing here tied Blyth to a glove reeking of tobacco and soot. Whimsy turned at last to the curtain, that curious curtain with its faint trace of soot. He drew it aside, studying the sash of the window behind it. The lock was firm, the glass unbroken. Yet there upon the sill he found the faintest smear of grease. Not new, but not ancient either. Someone had opened this window, closed it again, and wiped hastily. A small, almost invisible thing, but more telling than the bold initials of a glove. Whoever came that night had not only entered but left by stealth, contradicting the locked room perfection that had so pleased Latimer. As he leaned closer, something crackled beneath his foot. He stooped and picked up a thin scrap of paper, nearly invisible against the carpet. Half burned, it bore no more than a few words in hurried scrawl. "She knows." The rest was lost to ash. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. A warning or a threat? If the widow had known something, it was no testament to a solicitor's fraud alone. It suggested a secret larger, deeper, something others feared might come to light. The false neatness of the case began to unravel in his mind. Blyth, though hardly angelic, might well be guilty of lesser sins. Financial improprieties, perhaps even pressure upon the widow. But the staging of her death, the bribed maid, the blonde-haired visitor, the vanished key, these bore the stamp of someone else. Someone skilled in misdirection, who had used Blyth's proximity to the widow as convenient cover. Whimsy returned to the yard the next morning, where Latimer greeted him with a smug smile and the news that Blyth's arrest warrant was being prepared. "Too simple, Inspector," Whimsy murmured, almost kindly. "Our quarry has thrown you a bone, and you've swallowed it whole. But bones are for dogs, not detectives." Latimer bristled. "You've always fancied yourself cleverer than the yard, Whimsy. But the glove is a gift," Whimsy interrupted, his monocle gleaming. "Left too neatly, too obligingly. And tell me, Inspector, how often do murderers brand their evidence with their own initials?" "No, sir. Someone has written a little play for us, and you are applauding in the stalls before the curtain has even fallen." Latimer turned away with a scowl, unwilling to argue further. Yet Whimsy knew his words had struck home. That night, as the lamps glimmered once more over Kensington Row, the detective lingered by the window of his chambers, gazing out over the mist. Somewhere in London, the real hand behind Beatrice Harwood's death was waiting, content to let the authorities celebrate their false victory. But the game was not over. It had only changed its stage, and Whimsy, with a faint smile, knew that the shadows would stir again, because a criminal clever enough to shape such deception would not rest. They would strike once more, at the moment most opportune. He only needed to be watching when they did. The yard's satisfaction over Jameson Blyth's arrest proved as short-lived as the February sunshine. 3 days after the solicitor was taken into custody, Lord Peter Whimsy sat in his club with the morning paper folded neatly on the table beside him, reading the column with mild amusement. "Prominent solicitor charged in widow's murder." The headline trumpeted, but the text beneath betrayed unease. The Crown's case, it admitted, rested largely on circumstantial evidence. The glove, the initials, the contested will, too slender a rope, Whimsy thought, to hang a man who still protested his innocence with the vigor of one who believed he might yet clear his name. What troubled Whimsy more was not the fragility of the evidence, but the persistence of details that refused to align. the half-burned scrap with its cryptic, "She knows," the greased window sill, the maid bribed with a sovereign. These pieces were not accounted for in Latimer's triumph. They hung in the air like unanswered questions, whispering of a hand unseen. That evening, compelled by the tug of an idea, Wimsey paid another visit to the Harwood house. The constable on duty, weary of guarding a home where nothing now stirred, allowed him passage without fuss. In the drawing-room, Wimsey lit a single lamp and stood surveying the space as though he might coax its shadows into speech. His eye fell once again upon the letters tucked in the escritoire, unsigned, terse, hinting at financial strain. One bore a date several months past, and as he scanned it anew, a phrase leapt out. "The same as before, only this time she will not forgive. Same as before," Wimsey murmured aloud. He fetched the rest of the bundle, riffling quickly through them. The letters suggested not a solitary quarrel but a pattern, a cycle of borrowing and reproach, as though some long-standing dispute had flared once more. He carried this thought back to his chambers, where he summoned Parker from the yard. Over brandy, he posed the question, "Do you recall, old man, any matter, say, 5 or 6 years ago, where our late Mrs. Harwood was tangentially involved? Something financial, perhaps, something rather shady?" Parker frowned, searched his memory, and then his eyes lit with recognition. There was the Cranley fraud, wasn't there? Investment scheme that went to pieces. Half of Kensington lost their savings. Now that you mention it, I believe Beatrice Harwood's husband was among those who gave testimony. He died not long after, but her name cropped up in connection with a disputed account. Nothing criminal, mind you, but it caused a stir. Wimsey sat forward. "Cranley?" "Yes, of course, I remember. And was it not Lydia Crane's brother who stood trial before the case collapsed?" "Indeed," Parker said slowly, realization dawning. "Harold Crane. He escaped conviction, but his reputation was ruined. He went abroad shortly after. Lydia herself stayed in London." Wimsey let out a soft whistle. So the good companion of our widow, the pious friend at her side, carried with her a family shadow the yard has blithely overlooked. And Mrs. Harwood, who once helped give evidence in a fraud trial, later revises her will to favor the sister of the very man whose name was blackened. My dear fellow, do you not smell the pungent aroma of motive lingering here? Parker rubbed his chin. If Mrs. Harwood knew something about Lydia, or about her brother, that resurfaced. Precisely, Wimsey said, reaching for the half-burned scrap in his pocketbook. She knows. But what? That Lydia's loyalties were not so innocent. That Harold Crane had returned. Or that some business from the Cranley days had found fresh soil in Kensington Row. The following day, Wimsey took a quiet journey to an archive office where the old Cranley files were stored. The dust of forgotten scandals clung to the ledgers, but within them he found his quarry. Among the names of investors defrauded was indeed Henry Harwood, late husband of Beatrice. Beside his account, a notation marked disputed repayment, testimony pending, and in the margin, almost overlooked, was another name, Jameson Blythe, then a junior solicitor advising on the case. Wimsey's pulse quickened. Blythe, Harwood, Crane, the same 3 names, entwined years before in a fraud case that left bitterness and suspicion unresolved. The present crime was not the sudden impulse of greed Latimer imagined, but the flowering of roots planted long ago. When he returned to Kensington, he carried this knowledge like a candle into darkness. Questioning Lydia anew, he watched her closely. She spoke of Blythe's arrest with almost excessive composure, as though rehearsed. But when Wimsey, in the mildest tone, mentioned her brother Harold's name, a flicker passed across her face, a tightening at the lips, a tremor in the hand. "You know, of course," Whimsy said lightly, "that your brother's name still echoes in certain dusty files." She forced a smile. "That was long ago, Lord Peter. Harold has nothing to do with this." "Perhaps," Whimsy allowed. "But it is a curious coincidence, don't you think, that Mrs. Harwood altered her will in your favor, not long after her correspondence, hinted she was in some fear of discovery. Almost as though she believed you could be trusted, or feared what might happen if she did not." Lydia's composure wavered, but she said nothing more. Still, Whimsy felt certain the past had opened its long shadow over Kensington Row. The bribed maid, the blonde-haired visitor, the burned key, these might yet be traced back to a hand seeking not merely money, but silence for an old wound that threatened to bleed anew. That night, Whimsy sat long awake, sketching connections across a sheet of paper. Names linked to dates, dates linked to debts, debts linked to loyalties betrayed. A web stretched before him, and at its center lay not Blythe, as Latimer insisted, but the ghost of Harold Crane. Absent these many years, yet present still in whispers and fears. The crime, he realized, was not simply about a widow's fortune in 1930. It was the echo of fraud and ruin in 1924, the shadow of a case left unresolved, where anger and desperation had smoldered ever since. Someone had decided that Beatrice Harwood must never speak of what she knew, that the past must remain buried. But the past, like smoke, had seeped through the cracks of time to choke the present. Whimsy, staring at the tangle of lines upon his paper, murmured softly, "We've been watching the play as though it began with the widow's death. But the first act was written years ago, and until we grasp it, we shall never know how this one ends." The stage was set not in the bright drawing rooms of Kensington, but in the dusty shadows of forgotten fraud. And the true author of the crime had yet to make their entrance. Lord Peter Whimsy had long learned that straightforward questioning rarely pierced the armor of a determined liar. People hid behind habit, behind words rehearsed until they hardened into truth even in their own minds. But deception had a way of betraying itself when the ordinary rhythm of life was nudged askew. A false note in the music of conversation, a reaction too swift or too slow. Those were the cracks through which the truth might be glimpsed. It was with this thought that he devised his small experiment. Lydia Crane had proved skilled at keeping her poise, her piety and composure woven together like the black lace of her Sunday bonnet. Yet Whimsy believed she knew more than she admitted, perhaps much more. He could not confront her directly. To accuse her now would only steel her defenses. Instead, he chose an unconventional tactic, one that would force her to betray herself without realizing it. He invited her, quite innocently, to tea. She came, gracious and precise, a figure of modest dignity. Whimsy laid before her a tray not only of cups and scones, but also of papers, innocuous ledgers, or so they seemed. As they spoke of the late Mrs. Harwood, Whimsy shifted casually through the papers, pausing as though in thought. Then, with studied nonchalance, he drew forth a page he had prepared in advance, a sheet bearing a fabricated entry, a forgery of sorts, marked with the name, Harold Crane, and a date 2 months prior. It was a bait, nothing more, a suggestion that Harold, long vanished abroad, had lately stirred again in London. Whimsy did not press it into her hand or even remark upon it. He let it lie where her eye might fall, half hidden beneath other pages, and fall it did. As Lydia reached for her cup, her gaze flickered downward. In an instant too brief for words, her composure cracked. The blood drained from her face, and the hand that lifted the china trembled so violently that the tea sloshed over the rim. She recovered swiftly, pressing a smile into place, murmuring an apology. But the betrayal was done. The name had struck like a dart, and her reaction was sharper than any confession. "Dear me," Whimsy said lightly, reaching to rescue the teacup. "I do hope the china hasn't suffered. It's Worcester, you know, terribly unforgiving of sudden shocks." She laughed weakly, muttered something about clumsiness, but her fingers clutched at her handkerchief as though to anchor themselves. Whimsy, polite as ever, made no comment. Yet in his mind the pieces clicked further into place. Harold Crane was not as distant as she would have the world believe. Either he had returned, or she lived in dread of his return. The test, however, was not complete. A single tremor could be dismissed as nerves. Whimsy required more. And so, after Lydia departed, he arranged a second scene of play acting. This time, it was with Mr. Jameson Blythe, still confined at the station. Though the man protested innocence with the wary fervor of the wrongfully accused, Whimsy suspected that his knowledge of the old Cranley affair was more detailed than he had yet disclosed. He visited Blythe under the guise of sympathetic counsel, seating himself across from the haggard solicitor. "You know, old man," Whimsy said gently, "the Yard is frightfully keen on your initials turning up in that glove. Looks dashed awkward. But between ourselves, the case is a little more crowded than they admit. You see, there's a name cropping up again, one from the Cranley days. I dare say you recall Harold Crane." The reaction was subtler this time, but no less telling. Blythe's eyes narrowed, then darted to the door, as if to ensure no one else had heard. His jaw worked soundlessly for a moment before he forced out a laugh, thin and brittle. "Crane? Abroad these many years? Utter nonsense." Of course," Whimsy said cheerfully, as though satisfied. Yet he had seen it, the flash of fear, the instinctive need to deny. Blythe knew something too. Perhaps he had crossed paths with Crane before. Perhaps he had reason to dread his return. Whatever the truth, both Lydia and Blythe danced uneasily when Harold's name was spoken, like puppets tugged by the same invisible string. Still, it was not enough. The past was a fog, and Whimsy needed a lamp to cut through it. He pondered late into the night, pacing his chambers, turning over each fragment. Then, as dawn's light crept through the curtains, inspiration came. If Crane was indeed in London, hiding in some shadow, then he must leave a trace. No man could vanish entirely, not in this city of records and registrations, of clubs and creditors. Whimsy resolved upon a trick of bureaucracy. He drafted a notice, a false circular purporting to come from a financial recovery committee, announcing restitution for investors of the Cranley scheme. It named several individuals, including Beatrice Harwood and Jameson Blythe, and prominently listed Harold Crane as claimant. With careful arrangement, he ensured a copy would find its way into Lydia's hands through the post. Another would be left where Blythe might glimpse it, and others placed in circulation where gossip might carry them further. Then he waited. It was, in essence, a lure cast into the murky waters of the past. And sure enough, the fish began to stir. Within days, Parker brought him word of unusual movement. A man answering Harold Crane's description had been seen at a modest boarding house in Hammersmith, making inquiries after funds lost long ago. He had signed no register under his own name, but the landlady recalled him mentioning restitution. The trap had sprung. Whimsy allowed himself a rare smile. The unconventional clue, the forged notice, had flushed the hidden figure from cover. Crane was not a ghost after all, but flesh and blood, returned to a city that remembered him all too well. And if he had indeed come to London, the murder of Beatrice Harwood could no longer be seen as an isolated crime. It was the continuation of an old feud, sharpened by time and secrecy. The challenge now was to bring him into the open, to confront him with the tangled web that bound Lydia, Blythe, and the widow together. Wimsey knew that the next encounter must be handled with the utmost care. For a man who lived in the shadows of disgrace might kill again to remain there. He tapped ash from his cigarette, staring into the fire. "The curtain rises, Harold," he murmured. "We've seen your shadow long enough. Now let's see the man." The forged notice had done its work. Harold Crane's shadow, once little more than conjecture, had taken on substance. Reports from Hammersmith confirmed it, and Wimsey felt the tide of the investigation at last beginning to turn in his favor. Yet experience had taught him that every step forward in such affairs was met with an answering step from the enemy. Whoever wove this web had no intention of letting him pick it apart at leisure. The first sign came quietly enough, almost too quietly to mark as significant. Parker, returning from the yard, entered Wimsey's chambers with a look of irritation. "Dash it all, Peter! The glove's gone." The glove. Wimsey's cigarette hovered half raised. The one with Blythe's initials. Vanished from the evidence room. The constable on duty swears it was properly logged, locked, and sealed. Yet when Inspector Duff went to review it this morning, gone, not a trace. As though it had never been. Wimsey gave a soft whistle. Well, well. Someone's tidy fingers have been at work. Our phantom plays boldly. The disappearance unsettled Parker more than he liked to admit. The glove had been the yard's keystone, the linchpin that justified Blythe's detention. Without it, the case against him sagged like a tent with its pole removed. Blythe himself, when informed, responded with a weary shrug. "You see? Proof enough that I was never meant to hang for this. Someone's tidying up their own mess." His eyes, however, betrayed not relief but something closer to fear. For Wimsey, the theft was not merely a hindrance, it was a revelation. It proved beyond doubt that the adversary was no distant spectre, but present, cunning, and deeply enmeshed in the machinery of the case. The thief had not merely silenced one line of inquiry, but had also sent a warning: tread carefully, or the trail would vanish altogether. Still, the glove alone might be dismissed as mismanagement or corruption within the yard. The second blow fell 2 nights later, and it could not be so easily excused. At the Hammersmith boarding house, Wimsey had arranged to collect the landlady's statement, including her careful description of the man she believed to be Crane. She had obligingly written every detail in her neat script. A letter Wimsey considered vital, since she recalled particulars no one else had noted. The slight limp, the curious scar on the left temple, the clipped manner of speech. But when Wimsey called to retrieve it, the woman, flustered and pale, confessed that her letter had been stolen. Someone had broken into her bureau drawer during the night, rifling through her belongings, leaving behind nothing but disarray. "I swear it was there." "Sir," she insisted, wringing her hands, "I locked the drawer myself. And this morning, gone. As though the devil himself had come for it." Wimsey soothed her, thanked her kindly, and left with grim satisfaction hidden beneath his courtesy. Twice now, the enemy had moved to erase proof, and both times the hand was precise, deliberate. It was no blundering burglar, but a mind trained to anticipate his steps, a mind that knew what mattered and struck at it before it could harden into fact. Parker, however, was growing restive. "Blast it, Peter. This is more than a clever criminal. Someone must be feeding him word for word. How else could he know what we've gathered?" "Eh?" Wimsey said, staring into his glass. "It smacks of inside knowledge, someone within the circle, police, witnesses. Perhaps even those nearest the case, passes our secrets to him. And so long as he holds that advantage, he will remain one step ahead. The realization cast suspicion everywhere. Trust became brittle, crumbling under the strain of doubt. Lydia's nervous glances, Blythe's evasive tone, even Parker's own frustrations, all could be read as signs of duplicity. Whimsy, who prized loyalty above all else, felt the sting of uncertainty. Who among them might already be compromised? Who played double? The third theft came not from a drawer or a police shelf but from memory itself. Whimsy had taken careful notes of his conversations, every slip of the tongue, every curious phrase. He kept them in a leather-bound notebook written in his own shorthand. One evening, returning from a fruitless call in Bloomsbury, he discovered the notebook gone from his coat pocket. It had been there when he set out. It was not there when he came home. He sat very still, staring at the empty pocket. For the first time, unease gnawed at him. This was no opportunist's theft. The notebook had been lifted by someone with skill, someone close enough to brush his coat unnoticed. He replayed the day, crowded streets, the jostle of a hansom cab, the press of people outside the post office. Any of them might have been the hand. Yet the precision with which his notes were taken spoke less of chance than of design. The enemy was not only listening, but reading his very thoughts. That night, Whimsy found sleep elusive. He sat awake, staring into the fire, the glow throwing restless shadows upon the walls. Each shadow seemed to whisper betrayal. He could trust no document, no memory, no man. Every move must now be made with double care, for the adversary had shown both reach and daring. And yet, curiously, Whimsy felt a stirring of exhilaration as well. The theft of evidence, the erasure of proof. These were acts of desperation as much as calculation. Each theft declared the truth draws near, so near that it must be smothered before it breathes. Harold Crane, or whoever moved in his name, was not untouchable. He was cornered enough to lash out, and that meant the pursuit was striking home. Still, the danger was real. A man who tampered with police evidence, who burgled private rooms, who dared pickpocket the detective himself, such a man would not shrink from darker measures. If Whimsy was to continue, he would do so at great risk, with Parker perhaps the only soul left he could wholly rely upon. He rose at last, poured himself a measure of brandy, and murmured aloud into the silence, "Very neat, very clever. But evidence may vanish, truth will not. And the truth, my friend, will find you, whether by daylight or in your shadow." The fire crackled, throwing up sparks like fleeting stars. Somewhere in the city, the adversary watched, listening, preparing the next move. The game had sharpened. One wrong step, and Whimsy might lose not only the case but his very life. And yet, as dawn crept pale over the rooftops, he smiled faintly. The stakes had risen, and so had the challenge. For every vanishing scrap of evidence, there remained the one thing no thief could steal, the knowledge stored in his mind, waiting for the moment to be set free. The morning had begun with a deceptive calm. London's fog rolled lazily across the streets, curling around gas lamps like smoke from an unseen fire. Whimsy moved through it with deliberate caution, Parker at his elbow, each footfall measured. The city had grown silent in its own way, as if holding its breath, warning that danger was near, and indeed, danger had been near all along. Whimsy had barely settled at his desk, reviewing the scraps of memory from his stolen notebook, when a sharp knock on the door shattered the quiet. Parker swung it open to reveal a messenger, breathless and pale. "Sir, it's the Hammersmith house. They say it's Mr. Blythe." "Hey, he's been killed." Whimsy's fingers froze mid-air over his pen. "Killed," he repeated, the single word cutting clean through the morning haze. "Explain." The messenger stammered, unable to compose his account. Parker, ever practical, began questioning him, reconstructing the sequence. Blythe had been found early that morning in his bedroom, a single knife thrust to the heart, lying as if he had been waiting for someone to arrive. No struggle, no sign of forced entry, just the cruel stillness of death. Wimsey's mind, ever alert, began mapping the implications. Blythe had been a suspect, barely restrained by the thin veneer of law, but now he was dead. The case had not merely taken a turn, it had lurched into a chasm, wide and dark. Whoever had stolen the glove, the letter, and the notebook had acted with foresight, and now their reach had extended to murder. Arriving at Hammersmith, Wimsey and Parker found the scene eerily calm. Police cordons held back curious neighbors, and detectives whispered amongst themselves, doubt and fear evident in their eyes. Blythe's body was untouched by haste. He had not struggled because he had known his killer, or had he been caught unaware in a moment of unguarded trust? The question nagged at Wimsey's mind. He examined the room meticulously. The bedclothes were neat, the floor swept of any debris. No sign of forced entry, as the police reported. But he noted the slight scuffing near the window latch, almost imperceptible unless one knew exactly where to look. Someone had been here quietly, efficiently, with knowledge of the house's rhythm and of Blythe's habits. Parker shook his head, muttering, "This is beyond calculation, Peter. First the evidence, now a murder. What next?" Wimsey's eyes did not leave the scuff. "Not beyond calculation," he said softly. "Merely one step further ahead than we expected. And that is precisely what we must catch." The investigation took an immediate, urgent turn. With Blythe dead, the supposed resolution of the first crime evaporated. The thief, or murderer, was proving not only elusive but audacious, willing to strike at the core of the case itself. And if they could kill one suspect with such precision, there was little doubt that another, or even the detective himself, could be targeted. Back at the flat, Wimsey pored over what remained. The fragmented notes he had committed to memory, the partially corroborated statements of witnesses, the still, fresh trail of deception. Each clue, each inconsistency, now glowed with new significance. The glove, the stolen letters, the notebook. They had not been mere obstacles, they had been probes, testing the detective's reach and his readiness. The murderer had not expected discovery, they had expected submission. And yet Wimsey refused to submit. He began reconstructing the timeline. Tracing each step the killer must have taken, calculating how the second crime fit into the larger web. A pattern began to emerge, subtle but undeniable. The thefts had not been random, they were prelude, rehearsal, reconnaissance. Each act had cleared the field of witnesses. Each disappearance had softened resistance, leaving the killer unopposed for the murder itself. Then came the twist that truly rattled the city. Blythe's body, examined once more under the keen eye of a visiting coroner, revealed a second, hidden injury. A superficial mark on the forearm, almost invisible. A surgical precision, as though meant to send a message rather than cause death. Wimsey's brow furrowed. This was not mere killing, this was communication. Someone was signaling, and they knew the detective would understand. Wimsey summoned Parker. "Notice this," he said, pointing to the faint scar. "This is not the work of passion, nor the work of random malice. It is deliberate, and it carries intent beyond mere silencing." Parker paled. "You mean, the killer knew we would see it?" "I mean," Wimsey replied, "that we are now in a dialogue with our adversary. Every theft, every disappearance, every crime is a line of text, and the final word has yet to be written." The implications weighed heavily. The killer was both here and invisible, close enough to strike, careful enough to leave no misstep, and clever enough to anticipate every move. It was a game of chess with lives as pieces, and the board had just expanded. And then, as if to punctuate the threat, an anonymous note arrived at Whimsy's flat. Parker delivered it cautiously, white-gloved, as if it were a live thing. Whimsy unfolded it, reading the precise. Cold words, your triumph is fleeting. The next act begins at dusk. The detective did not flinch. Instead, he folded the note with deliberate calm, setting it on the mantelpiece beside the fire. So it seems, Parker, he said quietly, we have been invited to the theatre once more. And this time, the play demands more than observation, it demands prevention. We must anticipate not merely the next clue, but the next victim. Parker's hand tightened around the banister. And if it's us? Whimsy's smile was thin, but resolute. Then we shall act before the stage is set. The game has shifted, my dear fellow, but the rules remain unchanged. The truth must be found, and the criminal brought to heel, before another life is claimed. The sun dipped behind a veil of fog, painting the city in ghostly hues. Somewhere in the twisting alleys and silent rooms, the murderer watched, preparing the next strike. And Whimsy, alert to the shadowed movements around him, felt the weight of the chase intensify. The case had turned, the hunter had become the hunted, and the hunt had never been more dangerous. Every step from this point would be measured, every question calculated, every suspect scrutinized. For now, London held its breath, and the detective moved forward, aware that the enemy was not merely clever, but patient, and that the next twist, perhaps fatal, was already in motion. Whimsy closed his eyes briefly, picturing the paths that had brought them here, and the labyrinth still ahead. The stolen evidence, the hidden messages, the murders, all threads in a fabric of dark design. And within that fabric, he knew, lay the one weakness his opponent could not erase. The relentless logic of a mind unwilling to be deceived. The chase had begun anew, sharper, deadlier, and more intricate than ever before. The note still lay upon the mantel when Whimsy rose from his chair the following morning, his gaze fixed not upon it, but upon the ashtray at his elbow. It was there, in that trivial collection of burned matches and spent ash, that his mind began tracing the threads once more. Parker, pacing by the window, muttered of false trails and of the brazen hand that dared to turn murder into theatre. Yet Whimsy, detached in manner though never in mind, found his thoughts circling back to the smallest matters, the trifles others dismissed in the wake of grander violence. It was one such trifle, an almost forgotten remark, that stirred him now. At Blyth's house, the night before, one of the constables had muttered of an unusual smell lingering faintly in the room. Not gas, not alcohol, not blood. Something sharper, almost metallic. Whimsy had filed it away then, a footnote to a larger horror. But this morning, as the pale light broke across the cluttered flat, the recollection returned with force. Metallic, Whimsy repeated softly, more to himself than to Parker. Not the tang of iron in blood, but something residue perhaps. A habit or a tool. Parker stopped pacing. You mean the killer left more than just the wound? Precisely. Not in the grand flourish of a weapon, but in the smaller habits of their trade. A killer may cover their footprints, Parker, but they cannot so easily discard the things that cling to them. Their work, their tastes, their peculiarities. He reached for his notebook, or rather for the pages he had reconstructed from memory since its theft. There, in hurried scrawl, were fragments of testimony. A servant noting her master's tendency to polish cufflinks until they gleamed unnaturally. A neighbor observing that a certain guest always carried a faint smell of oil and brass about him. At the time, mere oddities. Now, linked with that metallic tang, they vibrated with meaning. Do you see, Parker? Whimsy's eyes lit with quiet fervor. We have been chasing movements, alibis and concealments, when the truth has sat in plain sight. Our adversary is no phantom. He is a creature bound by the habits of his hand. Somewhere in these trifles lies the key. The two men retraced the web of suspects. Blythe, silenced forever. Miss Harwood, evasive yet strangely persistent in her proximity to every turn of the case. Fenwick, whose financial ruin painted him desperate. And behind them all, the shadows of older entanglements, forgotten scandals whispered in half tones. Each bore a motive. Each carried the chance of guilt. But only one, Whimsy reasoned, could leave behind that faint signature of metal and oil. He rose abruptly. We must return to Blythe's house. There is something we overlooked. The rooms had been sealed, though Whimsy's name carried the weight of entry. Inside, the hush of death lingered. He moved straight to the writing desk, where papers had been neatly stacked by police hands, and then to the small side table upon which rested a pair of spectacles. Not Blythe's, he had not worn them in life, but curiously left there, as if forgotten in haste. Whimsy lifted them carefully. The rims bore the faintest trace of oil, not from skin but from constant handling by fingers accustomed to grace. And in one hinge, a smear of something unmistakable when held to the light. Brass polish? A clue left not by design, but by carelessness, Whimsy murmured. And yet it speaks volumes, Parker frowned. But who would leave their spectacles behind? Unless they belonged not to Blythe at all, but to his visitor. His killer. Just so, Whimsy replied, slipping the glasses into a handkerchief. And that, Parker, begins to narrow the field considerably. The pattern grew clearer with each step. The missing glove, the vanished letters, the stolen notebook, all carefully selected, all requiring nimble hands and a familiarity with delicate instruments. A thief, yes, but not merely one of brute force. No, this was someone whose life had long been bound up with fine mechanisms, whose fingers bore the scent of brass and oil, whose eyes required spectacles of peculiar strength. As they returned to the flat, Whimsy's mind threaded further. The anonymous note, with its theatrical phrasing, had been designed to dazzle, to unsettle. But beneath the show lay precision, calculation, and an unmistakable delight in craft. This was no ordinary criminal, this was an artisan of deception, whose habits betrayed them more surely than any confession. Late that evening, as the fog pressed thick against the windows, Parker read aloud the list of known associates tied loosely to the case. Among them was a name barely noted before, Gervase Lutteridge, a watchmaker by trade, dismissed earlier as a harmless eccentric who had once handled repairs for Blythe's household. His testimony had been straightforward, unremarkable. And yet now, viewed against the residue of oil, the forgotten spectacles, and the precise mark left on Blythe's arm, it rang with a different resonance. A watchmaker, Whimsy mused, his voice barely more than a whisper. One whose fingers are steeped in polish and brass. One accustomed to patience, to precision, to the delicate turning of gears. One who understands both time and the art of waiting. My dear Parker, I believe we have been staring at the pattern all along. Parker exhaled sharply. And he's been standing just outside the circle of suspicion. Safe because we thought him too ordinary. Exactly. The ordinary Parker is the perfect disguise. But in the end, it is the small habits, the polish on a cufflink, the smell in a room, the spectacles left behind, that undo the grandest masquerade. Whimsy leaned back, a weary smile flickering across his face. The pattern has emerged, and now the real pursuit begins. The city outside seemed to stir uneasily, as if aware that beneath its calm surface a net was drawing tight. Somewhere, Gervase Lutteridge moved with quiet confidence, certain his secrets remained hidden. Yet Whimsy's eye, sharpened by trifles, had pierced the veil. The case was no longer chaos. It was order concealed in disorder, a rhythm waiting to be exposed. And with that realization came both triumph and danger, for Whimsy knew that those who delight in intricate designs seldom surrender without one final, perilous move. Whimsy spent the night poring over the details, letting the small fragments of evidence align themselves in his mind like the carefully arranged cogs of a fine watch. Each observation, each hint of brass polish, each forgotten glove, each faint metallic scent, spoke of Gervase Luttridge's meticulous nature. Yet none explained the ferocity of his actions. A watchmaker could steal, manipulate, or cheat if driven by greed or revenge, but murder required a deeper impulse. Whimsy knew the answer lay not in the what, but in the why. Morning brought no answers, only a growing urgency. He returned to Blythe's house, retracing every step the killer could have taken, examining the spaces Luttridge had likely touched. The spectacles were now tucked in a protective case, a silent testament to oversight. Whimsy's eyes, however, were drawn not to what was present, but to what was missing. A subtle indentation in the desk drawer, a smudge of oil on the edge of the carpet, small clues that hinted at a deliberate choreography. Parker watched him quietly, sensing the detective's mind working through invisible threads. "You've got him pegged, haven't you?" he ventured. "Not yet," Whimsy replied, tapping the rim of the spectacles lightly. "Why understand the pattern, the habit, the craft? But comprehension of the mind behind it, it is still incomplete. There is something personal here. Something not born of circumstance, but of desire." His reflection led him back to an overlooked witness. Blythe's old housekeeper, Mrs. Calverley, who had spoken of Luttridge's unusual visits months prior. She had described the watchmaker as quiet, almost painfully polite, yet oddly fixated on the minutiae of Blythe's movements, his routines, and even the positioning of objects in the rooms. It was obsession, Whimsy realized, but with an unusual twist. Luttridge had never shown signs of greed, nor did he appear to harbor a grudge visible to the casual observer. His focus had been entirely on control, on the order of Blythe's world. He sketched a timeline, overlaying the known actions of Luttridge with the crimes. It was precise, almost ritualistic, the theft of letters at intervals, the subtle rearrangement of objects, and finally the murder itself. Each step reinforcing Luttridge's need to dominate the sequence of events. Whimsy's mind traced further back, to the watchmaker's own life, a childhood of strict routines, an upbringing in which control over small things substituted for lack of power over larger forces. And then it clicked. This was not merely a crime of opportunity or vengeance. It was an act of psychological compulsion. Parker frowned, trying to follow. "You mean, he killed because he had to?" "Precisely," Whimsy said softly. "The mind can be a cage as cruel as any prison. For some, the urge to assert order, when life feels chaotic, is irresistible, even when it leads to unspeakable acts. Blythe's meticulous life, his own control over fortune and influence, became a canvas for Luttridge's obsession. And when order faltered, the only solution, in his mind, was to remake it, through violence if necessary. The detective's eyes rested on the spectacles again, the faint trace of brass oil glinting in the morning light. Luttridge had handled them, had polished them with care, and in that habitual act, Whimsy recognized a form of comfort, small, intimate routines that allowed him to maintain the illusion of order while orchestrating chaos. Each murder, each theft, was a reinforcement of that control, a way to impose structure on a world that had long felt unpredictable. Whimsy summoned Parker to the street outside Luttridge's workshop, a narrow, shadowed building lined with the windows of a dozen small shops. Through the glass, the polished mechanisms of clocks gleamed like silver teeth. It was here, Whimsy knew, that the watchmaker's obsession had found its true home. "You see," Whimsy said, pointing, "observe the symmetry of his display. Every clock, every pendulum, every mechanism, arranged not by necessity, but by an internal compulsion. Luttridge's need to control is physical, tangible. The crime against Blythe, the theft, the subtle manipulations, all of it flows from the same source, a mind obsessed with precision, with domination over his environment, even if it requires blood." Parker swallowed hard, the implication settling like a weight. So it wasn't money, or spite, or revenge. It was madness? "Not madness in the casual sense," Whimsy replied. "Calculated, deliberate, yet driven by compulsion. We can predict his methods because they stem from his routines, his obsessions. This is the hidden motive. Control as an end in itself, exercised to the most extreme degree." They entered the workshop, stepping carefully across the creaking floorboards, the air tinged with the sharp scent of brass polish and oil. Each clock ticked in rhythm, yet none as regular as the movements of the mind that had designed them. Whimsy's eyes scanned the surfaces, noting the fingerprints, the smudges, the tools arranged in geometric precision. Then, in a small corner, a leather-bound journal lay partially open, its pages filled with meticulous records of appointments, observations of Blythe's routines, and cryptic annotations about the necessity of order. "This," Whimsy murmured, lifting the journal, "is the window into his psyche. Not a motive of greed or revenge, but the relentless drive to impose structure, to orchestrate life according to his will. Every theft, every act, every careful detail. We have seen the evidence, but this explains the intent." Parker glanced over his shoulder, unease creeping across his face. "And the violence? The killing?" "A final step," Whimsy said. "When order could not be maintained by observation alone, he intervened. He removed the unpredictable element, Blythe himself, to restore balance to his internal design. The crime was never random. It was inevitable to one with such compulsion." The detective flipped through the journal, noting the obsessive precision with which Luttridge had mapped every detail, every deviation from routine, every minute disruption that had caught his attention. It was a revelation not merely of intent, but of character. Here lay a man whose inner life was a lattice of order, whose outer actions had been guided by the strictures of his compulsions rather than passion, profit, or pride. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the quiet architecture of madness contained within the narrow workshop. Whimsy closed the journal gently, his mind already tracing the next steps, to anticipate Luttridge's movements, to prevent further harm. It was no longer enough to follow the evidence of objects or footsteps. They would have to follow the pattern of his mind, the compulsive logic that had dictated every act from the first intrusion to the last murder. The hidden motive had been revealed, shocking in its clarity. Not want, nor vengeance, but the deep, unyielding need to impose order upon a world that had denied him control. And now that motive, fully understood, gave Whimsy a weapon more powerful than any forensic clue. A psychological key that could unlock the final confrontation, expose the villain, and bring the orchestrated chaos to its inevitable end. As they left the workshop, the ticking of the clocks echoed behind them like a chorus of warning. Whimsy's lips pressed into a thin line. Understanding was one thing, acting upon it was another. The pattern was set, the motive revealed. And yet the next move, both theirs and Luttridge's, would determine whether the city would see justice or endure another carefully calibrated strike. Whimsy and Parker returned to the workshop as dusk settled over the narrow streets, shadows stretching long across the cobblestones. The city hummed with the indifferent rhythm of evening life, yet inside the workshop, an invisible tension throbbed. Whimsy had spent the last hours arranging everything with meticulous precision. Every chair, every clock, every reflection accounted for. The trap was not physical, but psychological, designed to exploit the compulsive logic that had guided Lutteridge from the very first act. He moved quietly to the center of the room, checking the alignment of the clocks. Each tick now felt like a heartbeat, counting down the moments until the confrontation. Parker lingered near the door, hand brushing the butt of his revolver, sensing both excitement and apprehension. "You really think he'll come?" he asked softly. "He must," Whimsy said, eyes scanning the room, noting the subtle shift in air currents, the faint sheen of polish on brass surfaces, the exact spacing of every tool. He cannot resist. His need for order, his obsession, will compel him to check, to adjust, to see that everything is as he believes it should be. That compulsion is as predictable as the movement of the hands on a clock. They waited in silence, the only sound the synchronized ticking of dozens of timepieces. Then, a soft scrape at the back door, the faintest indication of movement. Whimsy held up a hand and Parker stiffened. The sound repeated, tentative, almost hesitant, yet deliberate. Through the shadows emerged Lutteridge, his figure rigid, eyes scanning the workshop as if assessing every detail against some internal standard. His hands twitched slightly, a visible reflection of the compulsions that had driven his every action. He stepped forward cautiously, drawn by the perceived disruption in the perfect arrangement he had so painstakingly maintained. Whimsy said lightly, his voice cutting through the silence like the subtle chime of a bell, "I wondered when you would arrive." Lutteridge froze, eyes narrowing, a flicker of recognition and frustration crossing his face. I don't know what you mean," he stammered, voice tight. "This is my workshop. Everything is exactly as it should be." "Exactly," Whimsy said, moving slowly toward him. "And yet there are discrepancies, Mr. Lutteridge. Small, almost imperceptible flaws. A clock running a fraction fast, a tool slightly misaligned, a journal missing a page." The mention of the journal made Lutteridge flinch, a minute involuntary movement that did not escape Whimsy's notice. I don't know what you're implying," he whispered, stepping back toward the wall. "You are implying nothing," Whimsy replied calmly, circling him like a predator that knows its prey cannot escape. "I am merely observing the pattern. Your compulsion, Mr. Lutteridge, your need to impose order, to control every detail of your surroundings, has dictated your actions from the very beginning. And it has also dictated your weakness." Lutteridge's lips pressed into a thin line. "Weakness?" he asked, his voice brittle, defensive. "I have no weakness." "Ah, but you do," Whimsy said gently, pausing to point at a small misaligned clock on the far wall. "Imperfection, disorder, and the need to correct it. That is why you came, why you returned here. You could not resist checking, adjusting, confirming that all was as you required. It was inevitable." Lutteridge's composure wavered. He took an involuntary step toward the clock, then another, his fingers twitching as though compelled to touch it, to realign it. Whimsy's eyes gleamed with the quiet satisfaction of anticipation. "And now, Mr. Lutteridge," he said, "you find yourself trapped not by law or force, but by your own compulsions. You cannot leave without disturbing the very order you cannot tolerate being imperfect." Parker moved quietly to block the back door, revolver drawn, eyes fixed on the watchmaker. "It's over," he said firmly. Lutteridge's gaze darted between them, mind racing yet constrained by the invisible chains of his obsession. I did what had to be done," he whispered, voice trembling, "to restore balance. To maintain order, I couldn't allow chaos to persist." "You couldn't," Whimsy said softly, taking a measured step closer. "And now, compelled by the same need, you have walked right into the consequence of your own design. You see, the law need not chase you when your mind itself has dictated your capture." A long silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the clocks, each echoing the inevitability of what was to come. Then, with a shuddering breath, Lutteridge slumped into a chair, the tension in his shoulders draining. I understand," he said finally, voice raw. You always knew." "Yes," Whimsy replied, the hint of a satisfied smile at the corner of his lips. The evidence, the pattern, the motive, all in plain sight. Only a mind attuned to compulsion could bring it together, and only one who understands human psychology could predict your final act. For a moment, Lutteridge said nothing, his hands gripping the arms of the chair as if seeking to restrain the tremors of his own body. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. "Yes, it was never about money, never about revenge. I only sought order. Control." Parker stepped closer, securing the watchmaker's wrists with deft precision, yet keeping a wary eye on him. "Your order ends here," he said firmly. Whimsy, however, remained quiet, observing the man now stripped bare of pretense, the compulsive energy reduced to trembling acknowledgement. The final confrontation had not been a struggle of strength, but of intellect and insight, a battle of pattern against pattern, and it had been won by understanding rather than force. As they led Lutteridge from the workshop, the city lights flickered on outside, indifferent to the intricate human dramas unfolding in its shadowed alleys. Yet within the narrow streets, within the walls of that small, ordered world of brass and pendulums, a sense of closure settled. The hidden motive had been exposed, the compulsive architecture of crime understood, and the villain had finally been brought to heel, not by chance, but by the precise and patient orchestration of observation and intellect. Whimsy's eyes lingered on the workshop for a moment, noting the symmetry, the gleaming clocks, the quiet evidence of obsession now neutralized. He turned to Parker, voice low, reflective. "It is remarkable, Parker, how often the most dangerous adversary is not the one who acts out of passion, but the one who acts out of pattern. Predictable, logical, yet utterly unyielding until confronted with the truth of their own design." "And now?" Parker asked. "Now," Whimsy replied, "stepping into the evening air, we ensure that pattern is broken, that order is restored. If not for him, then for those who would have been next. Justice, after all, is its own kind of order." As they walked down the quiet street, the ticking of clocks faded into memory, replaced by the steady rhythm of footsteps and the promise of finality. The case, tangled and complex, had reached its resolution, and the shadows of obsession receded, leaving clarity in their wake, a truth unveiled not by chance, but by the relentless pursuit of reason, observation, and an understanding of the human mind at its most compelling and perilous. The night air was cool and crisp as Whimsy and Parker escorted Lutteridge into the police station, the quiet hum of the city juxtaposed against the lingering tension of the day's revelations. Every step felt measured, the cobblestones beneath their feet echoing softly, almost as if marking the rhythm of the resolution they believed had been achieved. Lutteridge remained silent, his shoulders slightly hunched, eyes cast downward. A man subdued by the weight of his own compulsions, seemingly stripped of menace. Yet Whimsy, ever attuned to the subtleties of human behavior, noticed something, The briefest flicker of hesitation in Parker's step, a glance thrown over his shoulder. Something was off. Inside the station, Lutteridge was placed under careful watch while Wimsey began his customary review of the evidence, his mind racing through each detail, each seemingly minor clue that had brought them here. The vanishing journal, the subtle misalignments in his workshop, the obsessive compulsions that had betrayed him, all of it now seemed accounted for. And yet, a gnawing sense of incompleteness tugged at Wimsey's thoughts. The finality they had assumed might be an illusion, and he knew better than to accept appearances at face value. Hours later, Parker joined him in the evidence room, a folder in his hand and a furrow in his brow. "Sir, there's something odd," he said, voice low. "I went over the recovered documents again, the ones from Lutteridge's office. There's a discrepancy in the ledger, a set of transactions that don't line up. It's as if someone tried to cover it up, but not carefully enough." Wimsey leaned over the table, eyes narrowing as he scanned the figures. Indeed, a series of transfers, subtle in nature, were missing the signature that would normally validate them. They were small, almost negligible on the surface, but their pattern was unmistakable. "Interesting," he murmured, tracing the lines with a finger. "These are not Lutteridge's handwriting. Someone has been manipulating events from behind the scenes. This changes everything." Parker blinked, unease flickering across his face. "You mean there's another player?" "Yes," Wimsey said, voice calm but edged with urgency. "Someone who has been orchestrating a series of diversions to ensure that Lutteridge's compulsions did the work for them. We were focused entirely on the obvious suspect, and in doing so, we overlooked the subtle hand guiding the outcome. The true mastermind remains at large." The realization was sobering, but Wimsey's mind was already racing. He began reconstructing the sequence of events, re-examining interactions, recalling conversations and seemingly trivial exchanges. And then it struck him. A detail he had dismissed in the flurry of the investigation, an innocuous comment made by Inspector Bradshaw earlier in the week. Bradshaw, ever polite and seemingly dedicated to the process, had mentioned in passing a peculiar pattern in Lutteridge's recent associates. Someone who had been unusually interested in the workshop's layout. Someone who had asked about the precise timing mechanisms. Wimsey's mind reeled. The innocuous comment now seemed loaded with implication. "Parker," he said suddenly, eyes brightening with focus, "I need to see Bradshaw." Now, the inspector's office was quiet, the low hum of the gas lamps filling the otherwise still room. Bradshaw looked up from his paperwork, surprised but not unkind. "Detective, to what do I owe this?" Wimsey held up a hand, cutting him off with a measured calm. "Inspector, there is a matter of utmost urgency. I require your full candor. During our investigation, I noted a peculiar interest you took in Lutteridge's associates, particularly regarding the layout and timing of his workshops. It was brief, almost casual, but it warrants clarification." Bradshaw's eyes flickered. Just the barest hint of a shadow crossing his expression. I don't know what you mean," he said smoothly, voice even. Wimsey leaned forward slightly, tone sharpened but controlled. "Do you not see, Inspector? Lutteridge was meticulous but predictable. Someone had to predict his responses, manipulate the environment subtly, and use his compulsions to achieve a desired outcome. That person is not a mere colleague or incidental acquaintance. They are, or were, within the precinct itself. Perhaps someone you trust implicitly." Bradshaw shifted uneasily, hands tightening around his pen. "Detective, I assure you—" "Enough pretense," Wimsey interrupted. "I have traced the irregularities in the ledger. They are deliberate. Someone masked them with faint handwriting, likely assuming that no one would notice the minutiae. But the pattern emerges clearly to one who knows what to look for. The inspector's composure cracked for the first time, a subtle but undeniable flicker of guilt passing across his face. Whimsy noted it with surgical precision. "You were not merely observing," he said softly, almost conversationally. "You orchestrated the final acts, ensuring that Lutteridge's compulsions executed your plan while shielding your own involvement. Tell me, Inspector, what drove you to such extremes?" Bradshaw's head fell into his hands for a long moment, silence stretching taut in the small office. When he finally looked up, his eyes were glassy but resolute. "It wasn't the money, sir. It wasn't about power. It was control. Control over outcomes, over the city, over justice itself. I believed I could guide events more effectively than the system, ensure the right results without the mess of human error. Lutteridge, he was convenient. A tool, nothing more." Parker exhaled slowly, anger and disbelief mingling in his expression. "So all this time the man we had locked up was just a pawn?" "Yes," Whimsy said quietly, almost sadly. "And a predictable pawn at that. The true danger lay elsewhere. Lutteridge's compulsions were exploited, his apparent culpability a carefully orchestrated illusion. And yet, even now we have the advantage. The pattern, once obscured, has been revealed. And with it, the opportunity to prevent any further manipulation." Bradshaw's confession was measured, almost rehearsed, yet in the tremor of his voice, Whimsy detected the lingering shadows of genuine fear, the realization that intellect, however cunning, cannot always predict the insight of another mind attuned to pattern and psychology. By the time dawn began to soften the edges of the city, the full scope of the case had crystallized. Lutteridge remained in custody, now recognized as an unwitting participant rather than a mastermind, while Bradshaw's role was laid bare, his motivations dissected with precision. The final twist had been revealed. Not a sudden attack, not an unexpected murder, but the unmasking of a mind that had operated undetected within the very structure of law and order, exploiting trust and knowledge with chilling efficiency. Whimsy stood by the window, watching the first rays of light glint on the rooftops. Parker remained at his side, silent but attentive. "It seems," Whimsy said softly, "that even when the apparent puzzle is solved, there remains the possibility of hidden layers. The final twist is rarely a flourish. It is a subtle recalibration, a reminder that human ingenuity, for all its brilliance, can never wholly anticipate the cunning of another." "And now?" Parker asked quietly. "Now," Whimsy said, turning from the window, eyes sharp and clear, "we ensure that every thread is accounted for, every deception exposed. Justice, patience, and understanding, these remain our greatest tools. The case may appear concluded, but vigilance must remain. Even the smallest misstep can conceal the most profound truths. The final twist is never truly the last. It is simply the awakening of what was always hidden." And so, with the city stirring around them, Whimsy and Parker prepared for the careful unraveling of the final strands, knowing that in every shadow, in every overlooked detail, the truth waits patiently for the mind that can perceive its pattern. The streets of London were waking slowly, the first hints of morning mist curling around lamp posts and shop fronts. Whimsy and Parker had returned to the precinct after a long night of cross, examining witnesses, poring over ledgers, and tracing Bradshaw's movements from the shadows of his office to the alleys he had frequented under cover of darkness. Lutteridge, finally recognized as the manipulated pawn he had always been, remained behind bars, his compulsions now harmless and contained. Yet the city itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the final resolution that had eluded them for so long. Wimsey leaned against a polished oak desk, eyes scanning the evidence that now lay fully compiled before him. "Parker, we have reconstructed every interaction, every subtle gesture, every misalignment that Bradshaw relied upon," he said. "Yet there remains one detail that went unnoticed until the final review. A remark made by a seemingly innocuous secretary. Something dismissed as idle gossip. It was the pivot, the silent fulcrum on which this entire scheme balanced." Parker frowned. "You mean there was another clue we overlooked?"
"Yes,"
Wimsey said, tapping the folded note on the table. Miss Hargreaves, in passing, mentioned that Bradshaw had been unusually meticulous about the timing of certain deliveries to the workshop. At first, it seemed irrelevant. But when cross-referenced with the ledger, it became evident these deliveries were never intended for Lutteridge's use. They were diversions, small manipulations that allowed Bradshaw to test reactions, to calibrate his plan without revealing his hand. Every step Lutteridge took was anticipated and exploited. The detective's gaze swept the room, resting on Parker. "This, my friend, is why one must never dismiss the seemingly trivial. Human nature, in all its complexity, leaves traces, moments of excess curiosity, an offhand question, a habit repeated with mechanical precision. Bradshaw believed he was invisible, that his orchestration was flawless. Yet the pattern, as always, revealed the true architect. Outside, a courier arrived, bringing a package for the precinct. Wimsey took it carefully, recognizing the wax seal of the city archives. Within were records that confirmed Bradshaw's network of diversions extended far beyond what they had imagined. Falsified reports, manipulated witness statements, and carefully timed absences that allowed him to move undetected. The breadth of his ambition was astonishing, the depth of his cunning unsettling. Yet despite this overwhelming evidence, Bradshaw himself was nowhere to be found. The station had been vigilant, the exits monitored. But a careful review of his movements revealed a gap. A window of mere minutes during which he had disappeared. Wimsey's lips pressed into a thin line. "So it seems, Parker, that while we have uncovered the full scope, the man himself has chosen to vanish. Justice, in the conventional sense, may elude us for now." Parker's jaw tightened. "So all this, his confession, the evidence, it counts for nothing if he's escaped." "Not nothing," Wimsey corrected gently. "We have, at the very least, illuminated the structure of his mind, the mechanics of his schemes. That knowledge is invaluable. Should he attempt to strike again, should he surface, we will be prepared. Remember, Parker, the most dangerous adversaries are not those who act in the open, but those who believe they are invisible. Our understanding renders him visible even in absence." They retraced the timeline one final time. Every ledger entry, every seemingly insignificant conversation, every overlooked observation was now connected in a coherent web. Wimsey spoke slowly, methodically, as if arranging chess pieces in his mind. Bradshaw exploited trust, pattern, and predictability. Lutteridge's compulsions were merely a tool. Miss Hargreaves' comment, trivial though it seemed, revealed the experiment's boundaries. Every missed observation now forms a coherent chain, leading us inexorably to the truth, even if the perpetrator remains physically absent. As the morning deepened, Wimsey and Parker stepped outside the station, the streets now bustling with commerce and early commuters. Wimsey's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the mist was thinning, sunlight beginning to glint off the river. "There is a certain satisfaction in this, Parker," he said softly. "Not in the capture of the villain, for he remains at large, but in the understanding of the method, in the illumination of the hidden pattern. Justice is not always immediate. Sometimes it is a matter of preparation, of anticipation. Today, we have gained foresight. That is no small victory. Parker exhaled, a mixture of relief and lingering tension evident in his posture. Still, knowing he's out there. Yes, Wimsey agreed, voice calm but firm. It is disconcerting, yet it is also instructive. Every detail we have uncovered, every misstep we have traced, is now a safeguard. Bradshaw's brilliance cannot hide him from an equally attentive mind. And if he should emerge again, we will be ready, not merely to react, but to anticipate. That is the true measure of our advantage. In the quiet that followed, Wimsey allowed himself a moment of reflection. The case had been convoluted, twisting like the gears of a clock, each turn revealing another hidden mechanism, another shadowed motive. The final twist had not been a sudden revelation, but the slow, inexorable unveiling of a mind that thrived in subtlety. And though the villain had slipped beyond immediate reach, the meticulous reconstruction of his plan provided a sense of order amid chaos. "Parker," Wimsey said, voice almost wistful, "let us never forget the lesson here. Even when the culprit escapes, even when the immediate grasp of justice eludes us, knowledge itself is power. Understanding the machinery of deception is the first step toward ensuring it cannot triumph twice. Today, we have that understanding, and in that lies our victory." Parker nodded, the weight of the night's revelations settling between them like a shared, silent acknowledgement. "So, justice served in its own way. Or perhaps," Wimsey said with a faint, enigmatic smile, "justice postponed, leaving an unsettling sense of unfinished business. Either way, the mind that perceives patterns will always remain a step ahead. The case may close in the ledger, Parker, but it never truly ends. It evolves, awaiting the next revelation, the next twist, the next challenge to illuminate the truth once more." The two men walked on, shadows stretching long across the cobblestones, carrying with them the knowledge that even in absence, the villain's design had been laid bare. The city hummed around them, unaware of the narrow escape, unaware of the subtle triumphs hidden in plain sight. Yet Wimsey's eyes were sharp, ever observant, attuned to the invisible lines connecting actions, motives, and consequences. The final chapter of this case had been written, yet the story's echoes lingered. A reminder that justice is never a static entity. It is a pursuit, a pattern, a vigilance that endures beyond the moment of capture. And in that enduring vigilance, the detective's genius remained unchallenged, quietly ensuring that even those who flee in the night could never escape the truth completely. The morning sun had fully broken through the fog, casting long, golden shafts of light across the Thames, and London was stirring with the familiar rhythm of commerce and conversation. Wimsey and Parker had paused on the riverbank, their eyes tracing the rippling reflections, as if seeking the answers hidden in the water itself. The case of Bradshaw had been resolved, or at least brought to its apparent conclusion, but a subtle unease clung to Wimsey like a shadow. "Parker," he murmured, his gaze fixed on a small ripple that distorted the otherwise perfect reflection of the bridges above. "Do you feel it? The resolution feels almost too neat." Parker glanced at him, brow furrowed. "After all we've been through, you think there's more?" "I do," Wimsey replied, turning to face him. "Even with Bradshaw's disappearance, with Lutteridge secured, and with the evidence fully reconstructed, there's a fragment, a detail so minor that it was almost inconsequential at first glance. Yet it continues to tug at the edge of my mind." He reached into his coat pocket and produced the folded note from the archives, the wax seal still faintly intact. "See here. This document, buried among hundreds of others, was dismissed for its apparent irrelevance. A delivery schedule, with times and dates that seemed ordinary. Yet if we scrutinize the spacing, the gaps, the pattern of omissions, it does not align with any of Bradshaw's known movements. Someone else must have been involved, someone who knew his methods, his timing, perhaps even his vulnerabilities. Parker leaned over the note, tracing the inked numbers with a finger. "Are you suggesting an accomplice?" "Not necessarily in the conventional sense," Whimsy said, his voice calm but deliberate. "Consider this. A mind capable of anticipating Bradshaw's every move might have had the foresight to exploit his designs. The clues are here, faint as whispers, and they indicate a presence we have yet to identify." They began walking along the embankment, the air filled with the faint scent of river and coal smoke. Every passing carriage, every distant footstep seemed amplified in the detective's mind, each sound a potential harbinger of hidden truths. Whimsy's eyes darted subtly to the shadows between lampposts, to the unnoticed faces of pedestrians, and even to the pigeons pecking at scattered crumbs, as if he could discern secrets in their random movements. "I have reviewed the ledger a final time," he continued, his voice carrying over the soft lapping of water, and a series of marginal notes, scribbled in a hurried hand, stand out. They refer not to the primary transactions, but to deviations, small, deliberate, almost playful adjustments to timing and quantity. Whoever wrote them was more than a casual observer. They were a participant in a game of foresight and misdirection. Parker's eyes widened. "So the game isn't over?" "Precisely," Whimsy said. He paused and plucked a small, folded scrap of paper from the hem of his coat, one that he had picked up in the alley behind Bradshaw's workshop weeks before. The paper bore a cryptic symbol, a swirl that might have been a signature, a code or a taunt. Bradshaw's absence leaves us with a vacuum, but this may be the true message. Not all mysteries conclude with the apprehension of a culprit. Some persist, in shadow, waiting for the right moment to reassert themselves. Parker studied the symbol closely, an uneasy shiver traveling down his spine. "It's almost like he, or they, intended for us to see this, but not yet understand it." "Exactly," Whimsy said, tucking the scrap carefully into his notebook. "The mind that leaves a breadcrumb never intends for it to be followed immediately. It is a test, a challenge, a way to measure our capacity for perception. We have passed the primary trial, now we are being invited to anticipate the next." As they walked, Whimsy's thoughts turned over every minor anomaly they had encountered: a shadow glimpsed in a doorway, an overheard remark dismissed as casual conversation, a seemingly misplaced item left at the crime scenes. Each was now recalled with a heightened sense of relevance, a potential clue in a broader puzzle they had only begun to perceive. They reached the steps leading to the station's front entrance, where the morning crowd flowed around them. Whimsy paused, surveying the streets with quiet intensity. "London has a rhythm, Parker, and within that rhythm, secrets move undetected. It is the subtle disruptions that reveal the presence of unseen forces. Today, Bradshaw has eluded us physically, but he, and perhaps others like him, cannot escape the meticulous record of their actions. Patterns, once perceived, endure, even if the perpetrators vanish." Parker's gaze followed a carriage turning a corner, then shifted to a man disappearing into a narrow alley. "So what now? We simply wait?" Whimsy's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "We do not wait, Parker. Observation is never passive. We remain vigilant, attuned to deviations from the ordinary, sensitive to patterns that hint at hidden motives. The case, as you say, is not finished, it has merely entered a new phase, And in that phase, we gain not only anticipation, but the opportunity to act decisively when the time comes. A distant bell tolled, echoing through the city, marking noon with solemn clarity. Wimsey glanced toward it and then back at Parker, the weight of unspoken possibilities between them. The streets are alive with stories yet untold. This city will continue to conceal its secrets in plain sight, offering them only to those who are prepared to notice, to interpret, and to follow through. The mystery never truly ends, Parker. It only evolves. Parker nodded slowly, a mixture of awe and lingering apprehension in his expression. And the people behind it? They may be anywhere, Wimsey said, or nowhere at all. Yet each action they take leaves traces, as faint as smoke but just as telling. And we, Parker, will be there to read them, as we always have. As they stepped into the bustling crowd, the detective's mind remained alert, scanning, connecting, calculating. Every whisper of the wind, every reflected shadow, every hurried step carried potential significance. The unresolved detail, the cryptic symbol, the pattern of deviations, they were invitations to a new game. One in which London itself was both board and prize. Even as they vanished into the pulse of the city, the lingering question persisted. Somewhere, beyond the reach of immediate perception, the next move awaited. And though the case of Bradshaw had concluded in its immediate sense, the greater puzzle, the labyrinth of motives, manipulations, and subtle signals, remained intact, promising future challenges, future revelations, and a continuation of the delicate, relentless pursuit of truth. And so, with the river glinting at their backs and the city thrumming around them, Wimsey and Parker walked onward, detectives still in the shadow of unfinished business, aware that the final answer was never absolute. That mysteries were living entities, and that every conclusion was but a prelude to the next enigma waiting patiently to be discovered.